For the sake of the recording, welcome. I'm Charles Davidson. I'm research faculty at the Carter School. I'm also the founder and president of Innovations in Peacebuilding International, and the director of the Political Leadership Academy at the Carter School as well. I wear a few hats around town. Today, I'm going to be talking about strategies for a new hybridity in peacemaking. And since we have such a long time and it's just me, I really want this to be a conversation if you would like to make it that. I'm going to be presenting my ideas and our work in South Kivu, but if at any point you have questions, just raise your little yellow hand by clicking at the bottom there. I think it's reactions, and then you can click your hand, and I'll see it pop up, and I'll stop. If I don't see it, you can just budge in and say, hey, I've got a question. No worries, because I like making these types of things conversation, because if nothing else, my main passion in life is not just peacemaking, peace building, but peace education. Giving all that I can from my life experience and learning to other people, so that we all move forward together in efficacy and peace building practice and knowledge. Hybridity. Before I move from the title slide, key word here. There has been and there is an ongoing onus on growing efficacy at the intersection of local and international peacemaking practice and peace building practice. Throughout this presentation, if I say peacemaking or peace building, for most intents and purposes, I mean both. So I'll stop repeating that over and over again. I think revelation that has occurred in the past 2 decades among scholars is in deeper and deeper ways why it's important for outsiders to truly work with locals in the peacemaking practice, and to re-examine their roles as we moved from peace practice as being somewhat of an overt, though charitable in spirit, kind of overtly neo-colonial mechanism, where outsiders, Westerners, and just in general, those who came from different classes, races, religion, whatever, held the power because they had the ability to come in, and they had the money, and they had all of the abilities to to fire partners and re-choose others if they weren't quite meeting their strategies, while very little effort was being paid to what would actually work in peacemaking. We've moved beyond that. Like the kind of neo-colonial ideas in scholarship are now well criticized, and what we have arrived at is books like Sarah Hellmuller's book, The Interaction Between Local and International Peacebuilding Actors, which is a fantastic read. It's really short, but it really does interrogate the present moment in what it means to partner with one another in such a way where you actually are giving, releasing power and adopting ideas of the local. However, scholarship can only go so far. And so the big question is, if we know why hybridity is so important, what good is it if we don't know how to actually practice hybridity, especially when things get challenging and the real power struggles begin. So this presentation illuminates what we're doing in the South Kivu, in the DRC, but it also, I guess, more directly discusses the how in peacemaking hybridity. So we investigate 2 intersections, not just local and international peacemaking relationships, which again is known as hybridity, but also peace scholarship and peace practice, known as praxis. Our donor and fellow peace strategist Milt Lauenstein initially proposed this idea, came to the Carter School. He's actually in this presentation today, he asked me and our team, like, how do we grow this efficacy? How do we grow an understanding, and how to do peace better, more efficiently, and in some ways get to the point? So it's been a lot of fun working with Milt. And we've been doing this since, I guess, the late summer of last year, and we've already seen a ton of success in the Congo, which I'll show you. So we kind of identify this need to surrender our efforts to local ideas called a local turn, or turning to the local, or the local turn. But again, the question remains how. And I, as a peace practitioner and peace scholar, stand among the types of people who uniquely have the ability to actually investigate both, which you'll hear a little bit about my background in a minute. These questions are not new. As I said, the idea that we need to turn to the local is not a new idea. Neither is the imperative to re-examine them, because, as I said, with books like Sarah's, people have been developing the idea consistently over the course of the past 2 decades. Rather, next steps include investing in learning how to effectively implement strategies that acknowledge these scholarly conclusions, but put them into practice. So I'm currently working in a cycle of peace praxis where theories in scholarship inform our practice, but now, as you'll see what this presentation is about, our practice over the course of the past 8 months is now informing theory, supplementing with the how, but also growing theories of hybridity, which every time I present it in scholarly communities, I'm finding people are saying, wow, that's great. It does feel somewhat revelatory. And again, I think we stand uniquely poised as practitioners and scholars to inform this literature. And I do feel like we're just getting started, which is really exciting. But that is what I'm presenting today. My background, when I was 21, I bought a ticket to Iraq because I wanted to learn more about what life in war zones was all about. It came from a young adult experience where I recognized the plight of vulnerable people, especially children and widowed women who were kind of beholden to violent actors, as well as international actors who came in and sort of like imposed their ideas on them without any real say in their future within the agendas of peace building actors. But more importantly, cycles of violence, poverty, malnutrition, education, etc. And so I went to my mentor at the age of 20 or 21, and I said, I really want to dedicate my life to this idea of bettering this process of peacemaking and making life better for others. So he actually gave me some of the best advice I ever received, especially as a a white American male. He said, "What do you know about any of that?" And I said, "I don't know anything about that." And he said, "Good, that's the first step. Now leave and don't come back until you do." And he was really kind of dead serious about it. And so while I would never give that advice to anybody myself, because of, I think, some of the challenges that are inherent in going to war zones without any sort of network, it did show me, it did give me the ability to learn practically and through firsthand observation just exactly what outsiders were doing. And I kind of give the example of in Afghanistan. I during that time of learning, I traveled to Iraq, Afghanistan, Uganda, Lebanon. I lived in Colombia for a while. And in each place, I got to observe different types of conflict and their effects on society. But in times like Afghanistan, I lived there for 10 months and I had a job teaching English, and I just, I did life. And, we would come under attack but more importantly, I was able as a civilian to just go to restaurants and have coffee and go to the market. And I would be in, a taxi, or I would be drinking coffee with a friend or something like that. And we would see these convoys roll by with up armored vehicles and weapons and antennas and an escort. And I realized that I said, who are these people? It's not the military. And I was like, they're the peace builders, right? They're the peacekeepers, or they're the peacemakers. And I thought to myself, like, why, how are they doing anything? Like, if they're in their compounds, in their vehicles, and they're rolling by with weapons, while I sit with locals and drink coffee, what is it that they're missing here? And so that was one of the first keys of me understanding, if we are going to build peace as outsiders, we actually have to be with insiders. We actually have to be with the insider. We actually have to be with the local. And that kicked me off in my early life of being willing to simply shut up and listen, and understand that peace already exists in the minds of the local. We just have to be patient and humble enough to actually listen to the strategies that they present. So fast forward. After all the countries I mentioned, we'd actually launched, my organization had actually launched peace building initiatives in Iraq, Afghanistan, Uganda, and Burundi. And we looked across Lake Tanganyika from Bujumbura, Burundi, and into the Congo. And we thought, is that kind of, for us, is that the final frontier? The places one of the harder places that, for us in our minds to work. And we decided as a team to just go do it in the way that we always had, reaching out to people, reaching out to locals with ideas. And we happened upon these two in the slide there. On the left is David, and on the right is Terry. These two were former child combatants who departed the fighting groups for a better future that they envisioned for themselves. And they started their own NGO. Extremely low funding, always scraping by, but every time they got funding, they would go into the armed groups and invite any of the young people in the armed groups out, and help to reintegrate them back into society by asking them, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? And it's like a novel concept, right? Like where you would actually just ask the person that you were trying to help, what do you want to be? Who do you want to become? How can we help you? And they had, there's no internationals on their staff. It's all Congolese. And I think the majority of them are former combatants themselves. And they invited me to come see them. And I was already planning a trip to the Congo. So I said, yeah, I'll come meet you. And about 2 days before I was supposed to get on the plane, they said, we told the armed groups about you. They want to meet you. I was like, well, why did you tell them that? That seems like a really bad idea. They said, no. They want to hear from you. It's fine. It's safe. You'll be okay. But I'd never been to the Congo. I'd certainly never met with former child soldiers. I was in a position where I didn't even really know these people. But I thought to myself, how are you going to claim to be doing a new thing and building peace among people who are fighting if you're not willing to talk to the people who are fighting? And so I just went and trusted that my destiny was in a higher power's hands, and we made it. We went to deep into the countryside in South Kivu and met with, as you see on the right, several armed group leaders from around the bush, and they really just wanted to talk and hear, what I had to say about child soldier demobilization and peace for the Congo, which wasn't much because I had never worked there. And so I said, you tell me. And what that did was it started kind of a domino effect for me of recognizing that not only do we turn to the locals, but we actually have to understand that even those who are fighting, those who are engaged in conflict, they are indeed human. And they do experience human emotions, human needs, and human logic. And so it is our duty as peace builders to be quiet again and listen, not just to those who are dedicated to peace, like Terry and David, but those who currently are engaged in fighting, like those on the right. And so that launched 6 years for me on a shoestring budget working in the Congo. And we've seen under my previous efforts before our current project, we had seen over 100 child combatants sustainably demobilized with, we think, zero recidivism. The details of that project are something I'll happily talk more about, but not during this time. So we lost Terry, the guy on the right, to a heart attack at age 31. Make no mistake, this work is dangerous. It's challenging. It is full of stress. As a child combatant, Terry led an extremely challenging life. And as a peacemaker, he was threatened often, and he had more on his shoulders than we could ever imagine. And we lost him last year at the age of 31. So David took up the torch single-handedly, and because of his past in the militia groups, but because of his intent and his professionalism, he now has the ability to go both into the bush and talk to militia leaders, but he can also walk into a presidential office in Kinshasa. So he has fluency and the ability to move in and out of these spaces in such a way that he is absolutely an asset that this entire program leans on. David is the type of person that, as I'm talking about my strategies today and kind of what we're learning in New Hybridity, when I say partner with these types of people, what I mean is David Basha. He is an absolute diamond in the rough. This picture was taken just weeks ago as he was talking to several child combatants outside of his town. So we set out to ask how, again, recognizing the importance of hybridity, but really not understanding how to go about doing it. Milt and Alp of the Carter School empowered me in such a way to kind of follow these hunches, and I could not be more grateful to both of them. Alp giving me the ability to pursue this, both from the practitioner standpoint, but also as a scholar and as research faculty at the Carter School. It's just been an absolute dream come true, and as we succeed, I think the Carter School is in many ways, like we're kind of putting our money where our mouth is. That Alp's conviction is that scholarship should inform peacemaking practice, and I thoroughly agree and hope that my work amplifies that conviction. So in examining new approaches to how, we've experienced success in the following ways. This is a bullet point list. Each successive slide is going to illuminate each bullet point. So accompaniment, not placement of partnerships. So we don't say we put the insider up front, right? Because that's just still another way of exercising agency over, right? And sort of insinuating that it is our choice to place other people, and so that's still kind of got neo-colonial and power over dynamics. Instead, we practice humility in accompaniment, right? Where it's like we're with you, we're here to serve the process. We also really have to embrace reality that this is challenging work that we don't know a whole lot about. I don't know what it's like to be a child combatant, and I certainly don't know what it's like to be a child combatant in the Congo. But David does, and so we have to embrace the fullness of reality when positioning ourselves relative to local peacemakers. And then we try to use the word accompany as much as possible. That we indeed have a role, and those roles, when outsiders and insiders place their strengths together, great things happen. Working with government despite the costs, re-examining the role and necessity of money, necessity of direct involvement with current and former fighters, amplifying the nexus of women's lived experience, locally developed success indicators and press coverage, and finally delineating output with outcome, which is especially a Milt Lowenstein idea that I have grasped and am running with. So here we go. Submission to local strategy, planning and execution, and mediation. No one knows the conflict like the insider knows the conflict. Bar none, finished. They didn't get a PhD from the Carter School, fine. They still know more about this conflict than I ever will. And so putting myself on an equal playing field and saying we are doing this together, it is not just the implication that we are sharing the power, but we actually have to demonstrate sharing the power. And what Sarah's book is going to tell you a lot about is this idea that you might say that you're going to share power. You might say that the local is out front, that you are submitted to their ideas. But ultimately you have to get much more nuanced in your actual application of the idea, right? So take, for instance, the idea of money, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. Think about what it means to be David, right? Who before our project was making, I won't reveal his salary, but he was not making money, right? And he had 5 kids, and he had Terry's widow, who was his best friend. Terry is now gone, and so he was caring for her family as well. The implication is that, hey, we're going to come in and I, the outsider, am going to partner with you, and hey, we're on equal footing, right? But the considerations we have to make is David is still aware of the fact that the money is in my bank account, not his. And so it may be easy for us to sort of say that we are going to put ourselves on equal footing with the local. but we have to consider the power dynamics that are implicit to the process, right? So if we disagree about something, what is the first reaction, not just of David, but of anybody you're working with? That is, if I disagree with this person who has all the power and the money, it's going to leave, and the project will go down the drain. And so I can't, as the local, truly come against the opinions of the power of people who have the power without putting the project on the line. We have to recognize that if we're bringing funding, we have the power, regardless of how much we say we're sharing it. The implication is that it will always be ours. And so what we have to re-examine is what does conflict between the leadership actually look like? And what I'm finding is that I sort of set myself out during this project in South Kivu, and I told Milk this. We're just going to surrender to the local. We're just going to say, every time we disagree, we're going to say, you go ahead, let's try this out, right? With some exceptions, obvious exceptions that I won't get into, but there's practicalities that we had to kind of just illuminate and inform about processes and stuff. Ultimately, what we found was that he was right 90% of the time, because again, he is the insider. But what was important was there was 10% of the time when I relinquished the idea that I was right, and we found that we should have gone with my idea. So that's where the nuance comes in, right? Because what we have to do is we have to say, I was right, you were wrong, nothing changes. And we have to be overt about that. There's no punitive action, et cetera. And so the more often that our partners can see that we are not going to take retaliatory measures if there is conflict, the more trust that can be built in the relationship. And this is extremely reductive. And I'm sorry that I have to sort of put this all into one slide. I am writing a book about this stuff, so I hope that you read it. But the idea is being, we have to be, if partnering and submitting to local strategy is what we're aiming for, the point is we have to be self-reflective enough to consider the nuance of what that actually means. The involvement of the government despite challenges. By the way, all these pictures are mine. They were provided to us by our partners. This happened just recently as our partners were going village to village, camp to camp, inviting the armed groups to the peace talks that just took place last month, which were incredibly successful. Involvement of government in spite of challenges. Listen, the government is scary, right? For me, going all over the world, like I've always been most frightened when the government took me in, because they have the power over the body, right? They can arrest you, kill you, they can disappear you, they can ship you back, they can make you leave the country, etc. But governments are also really expensive, especially in places like the Congo, where we are asking to do these, peace initiatives, and they're like, well, we want to be involved, obviously, and so we have fees. And it's so challenging for me because the knee-jerk reaction is to say, we don't need you, we don't need to work with you, we're not going to pay into your government fees, et cetera, and we can pull this all off for less than half the cost if you weren't involved, so never mind, which is what I was tempted to do. But what we're finding is that if you are truly going to interact with a conflict in another country, the government has to be involved, because there is no peace if the government doesn't allow it, right? You can't work behind them, you can't work in spite of them, because a permanent peace is not going to take place if it's not sanctioned, right? And so one of the lessons I've learned in the past from my work was when I was in the bush in the Congo at a school, meeting with several armed group leaders. There was also a government component there. And I said, why are they not going to war? Why are they not battling one another? And the local said, well, it would be mutually assured destruction, so everybody's at peace. And my driver locked his keys in our car. So we were locked out. And I turned around to find this soldier pointing his bayonet. I was kind of seized up. I'm like, oh no, what have I done wrong? And he just signaled me to move aside, and he drove his bayonet into the car frame and wrenched open the door, and somebody snagged the keys with a stick. And what I've learned that day was, indeed, government's populated by humans themselves, and so you can still deal with the government not as a system necessarily all the time, but as an organization populated by humans. And so what that led to was a few postulated actions that we've been testing that re-examines the role of government and their willingness to stick to their guns as far as their requirements, especially regarding money and control, and which we're going to get to a little bit on the next slide, the role of money. But essentially, there are a lot of systems in places like the Congo that perpetuate ideas of it being like an NGO generated economy. And so government has specific roles that they play within the NGO economy that demand certain types of payments and kickbacks and authorizations that can make it really, really challenging, right, to get the work done, especially financially. So what we tested was, what if we just say we're not going to pay? Not because we want to buck the system, but because we don't have the money. What we found was that the peace talks that we just had last month, in November, cost us about $30,000, 30 to 40. But that similar peace talks that had occurred in the past ran the organization $300,000 to $400,000 for the same exact type of outcome. And so when we started going through the government mill of application and permissions, and we started getting bills for their approval, we just simply said we don't have it. And that was the truth. We did not, because the pilot project was funded at a certain amount. But I was betting all of my chips on the fact that this government that is populated by people, when it came down to an individual putting a stop to the process because we couldn't fork over $3,000 or $4,000, that they wouldn't actually put a stop to it. And sure enough, when I said, hey, so sorry, we don't have the money, but I understand that means you have to stop the process, they would say, well, never mind, go ahead. Because what I think happened was that nobody was willing to be the person who put a stop to a peace process. So we got through without it. However, but there's still a backside to all this, right? Because you still need government ownership. This isn't just about the money. And so as we started to see these successes popping up, right, and successful dialogues happening, peace has been on the rise since November. We've seen a dramatic downfall in violent acts in our region. The government has started to take credit for a lot of what we're doing. And when I saw it happen firsthand in real time, I got really mad. I'm like, no, hold on. This is us. This is David. This is AJDC. This is the local people doing this. And so I called a mentor of mine now, and he said, no, this is exactly what has to happen. The government must take ownership of what's happening. You're doing the right thing. Let them have all the credit. That's the hard part of our job, is relinquishing the credit. But if government takes ownership of it, not only do they invest into it, but they then act as an insurance for the possibility of averting failure of the process later on. So the quicker you can get the government to start taking credit for it, the better, because in that way, it diminishes the likelihood that they will allow it to fail later on, because it becomes a necessity of saving face itself. So I'm not talking about manipulation of government. I'm simply talking about new strategies of allowing ourselves to work with government in spite of the challenges. There's more to be said, but I'm going to move on. The direct involvement of current and former fighters. This seems like a no-brainer, but oftentimes it's not, right? Oftentimes, peace-building organizations will work with peaceful people to engage in peaceful acts without ever actually encountering the people who are pulling the trigger. And it's not that, it's not that somehow if you're committing acts of violence that you understand culture better. That's false, right? But you do understand the realities of what it's going to take to implement a peace process better if you're the one who's fighting. And so engaging current fighters when at all possible, which is very possible in the Congo, we've been doing this whole time, but also former fighters, people who made that transition out and can speak directly to the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process, like David can, gives you a firsthand knowledge of how to go about doing this. And so my strong conviction is that an absence of those voices is a waste of time and money if you're taking guesses as to how to go about a process that people have lived out in their real lives. So engage them. as well as behind the scenes stakeholders. What they're called in the Congo is string pullers, puppet master kind of implication there, where indeed people do profit from fights like the Congo. And so if they're the ones who are making a profit, controlling the groups for political ends and reasons, ultimately it's not just the fighters you have to consider, but also those who are investing in controlling them. And so we are quite overtly engaging in the process of planning peace actions that involve the continued engagement of these conflict entrepreneurs behind the scenes. If you choose to ignore them, you're not really engaging the holistic nature of peace building. And so this sort of kind of rabbit trails a bit from hybridity. This is more peace building strategy, but I wanted to throw that in there just to kind of illuminate one of the things that we're engaging. Redefining the role of money in NGO economies. I've already spoken mostly to the issue of money through my other slides. But there is I think, a deeper truth to the role of money as a kind of corrosive power, both in local organizations, but kind of inconveniently, but in a really deep way, international organizations, where when you have something, I was at the ISAs last week and somebody referred to it as the peace building industrial complex. Organizations that need $300,000 or $400,000 to pull off, like a soccer match in a war-torn country and then call it peace, are going to come preloaded along with their donors, with a lot of necessity that has really nothing to do with the peace process. And so when we are sinking our teeth into this process in South Kivu, what we found is that if we've really had to just kind of take the tack that money is poison to a lot of processes. Is money absolutely necessary? Yes, you have to have money. You have to be able to, feed people when they come to the table. You have to be able to pay people to do their job and go out and interview armed group members. You have to fly yourself to and from the place. Like, there is a demand that can only be remedied by finance. But our strong conviction is that not only is it doable for far less, the implication is that it really should be, it must be that we're investing less and less money into these processes so that you can actually focus on the process of peace and not standing up, a 65-member NGO to solve a problem of organizing a soccer match. And I'm being a little bit facetious about that. It's not, not reality, but I do think that money has to be really implicated in part of the reasons why peace does not exist in places like the Congo. Another, I think, inconvenient truth about money in the Congo is something called an NGO economy, where there's been conflict in the Congo for so long that a lot of people in this country have gotten used to the fact that NGOs bring money and that's what fuels economies. So you have things like per diem, right, which has been just the dirty word of our project, where for so long, for 2-3 decades, people have gotten used to the idea that outside NGOs will pay them to come to the table to talk about peace, that it becomes a type of career, right? So when we first started inviting people to our peace dialogues, they would say, well, where are you going to get your per diem from? And I said, well, how much is per diem? They said, well, $500 to $600 a day. I was like, well, we can't pay that. But what we're finding is that a lot of organizations do pay that. And that's where you get the $300,000-$400,000 budgets that arise. And so again, we just sort of said, like we said to the government members, we don't have that, and I'm sorry, we're not going to pay it. We would still love it if you came to the table anyways. And what we found is they did come to the table anyways, because actually the people who were in this for the right reasons of building peace, they still wanted to come. And we wound up, did we still pay them? Yeah, we still paid them $50 total for their whole 4-day extent there, but it was an actual per diem, right? It was, we fed them, we gave them hotels, transportation, et cetera. And so the more we can move away from the toxicity of like the social implications of money in the peace process, I feel like the more equipped we're going to be to actually pursue peace and not hold up economies based on the pursuit of peace. Renegotiating the role of women. Listen, a lot has been written about this, and I, as a straight white middle class American male, understand my place. Okay, like I'm not. I recognize that a lot of smarter people than me are talking about issues of women in peace building in ways that I do not research, and they speak better to it than me. However, there's one incredibly important detail that we're finding when we're investigating this nexus of international and local peace building, and that is there is a distinctly woman-based role of informing strategic peace building planning that you can't get from anybody else. And that is, women live at the nexus of the domestic life and the violent life. Many of these women literally do. Like they're literally mothers and caretakers, but they also pick up weapons and go fight. Congolese women are especially known for being, at least in the Kivus where I've worked, very entrepreneurial, very business-minded. And when we were talking to them in one of our strategy sessions, we said, what are your thoughts on this? Where are we at? And they brought up questions that were uniquely positioned to interrogate our processes that we had to acknowledge that we weren't going to get from anybody else. Questions like, if we do lay down our weapons, if our husbands and brothers and sons lay down their weapons, who will protect us? Who's going to protect my family? Additionally, one particularly insightful colleague of mine, Congolese woman, said, you can invest all you want in my village. You can bring $1 million and stand up all kinds of businesses. But how many different mechanics do we need in a village of 200 people? And if we all have access to all of the venture capital that we want, who are we going to sell our stuff to? And, it was kind of an obvious point when you hear it like that. But she said, the issue is that we grow wheat. We need to get to the village that catches fish, but we cannot get to that village because every time we get on the road, we get robbed or raped or murdered. So we got to talk about the road. And so again, there's these insights of like paying attention, not just to women, but to a diverse set of actors that can specifically address issues and locations of social life that we do not have the ability to, that the fighters don't have the ability to, that the local peace actors don't have the ability to. And so it's people like religious leaders, women, entrepreneurs, village chiefs, et cetera, that can actually paint a larger picture of diversity of approach. Are there any questions? I feel like I've been talking for a while. I haven't seen any little hands, so there's nobody in the chat. This is cool though, 19 people showed up. All right, we'll move on. Locally planned measurables and press. So I think one of the things about living in Washington, D.C. is the prevalence of monitoring and evaluation, or M&E as it were, among international development actors, peace building actors, et cetera. How do we know if we've been successful, right? And I think that for me, I was a little bit jaded coming into this process via scholarship, where, in my peace building practice days, I would just say like, well, are people killing each other less? Is that like enough of a measurable, or do we need to put, logarithms and stuff over this and asymptotes and stuff, right? And it sounds stupid. In some ways it is. I was quite stupid in understanding what M&E really was. But at the same time, I think one of the challenges in international acting, peace building acting, is bringing in your measurables and saying, okay, here's how we're going to know, right? When it's a bunch of people in a Washington, D.C., office building who design these really cool charts and graphs. But what we don't do is listen to the locals and say, how is your life challenged right now? And how do you want it to be better? And if peace is built, how will you know it? And so actually stopping and listening and admitting to the fact that maybe proper quote unquote M&E is not going to be useful in a situation where a single mother of 5 who's trying to feed and educate her children is either going to be able to say, now this is solved or now it's not. Now, listen, I am not trying to attack evaluation. I'm not trying to attack monitoring. I have a PhD, like I'm a scholar. My wife is a research director at the Aspen Institute. I recognize the deep value of these types of systems. I am simply saying that we have to include local actors in developing them. And I think beyond that, and I put this on the same slide for a reason, local press, because ultimately what monitoring and evaluation is about is transparency. It's about efficacy, obviously, but it's also about transparency. Is this working? And engaging local press, which is something that we've been doing at every turn in this project, is allowing us to see this project and its effects through local eyes. How are local people seeing this? Is it working via their news stations, their radio stations, their journalists? What are they saying about it? Because a lot of times what a local journalist can tell you about what has happened is way different than if you sent in an outsider to take note of what was happening. And finally, and possibly the most feather ruffling, though I think that we would be hard pressed to find many people who strongly disagree with this, is delineating between output and outcome. And I am working very closely with Milt Lauenstein in this, who is the donor for this project. And this is something that he and I have talked about a lot recently that I've really latched onto. But output is not outcome. Doing programs is not peace, right? I've read some things lately that argue to the contrary, that getting people to do peaceful things is peace and it's moving in the right direction, which I don't disagree with. But we do have to be able to move beyond like showing charts and graphs and showing budgets and programs implemented if behind us in the place we're working there is no change in the peace process, or there's no actual reduction in violence. So I think as an institution, we as peace builders have to come to terms with the fact that, are we running programs and demonstrating our output as our outcome, or are our outcomes actually organized toward what it is we're in pursuit of, which is peace? And listen, I mean, this is a challenging thing. I'm absolutely in no way implying that my little slideshow slide is the long and the short of it, right? But I do think we have to think longer about what we as outsiders allow ourselves to believe to be productive without looking and listening to the insider about whether or not that's true. Challenges, this is my last slide. A company don't place, I talked about this at the beginning, it's very, very challenging. We're gonna have to continue to work through this, and I don't know if it can be technically written about enough to fully explain what's going on behind the need for humility in the outsider. What's best will still need to be negotiated with the donor. Regardless of who you're working with, people are going to have ideas about why they're donating. This is especially true if that donor is a foreign government and that government's taxpayers has certain things to say about where that government's money is going. So we might say, we're going to turn the show over to the locals and help, accompany them. But that's not how government money is going to necessarily be spent in the millions and millions of dollars that different governments give away if that doesn't align with what taxpayers want. So we can't just say like, hey, we fixed it. We know how to do this now. There is still a lot of dialogue to be had between those who are acting and those who are giving. And finally, some formalization of approach and management is always going to be necessary. You don't have to sacrifice organizational standards for the sake of accompaniment. Which means, if you have reporting standards, you have budgeting standards, you have monitoring and evaluation standards that your company, your board demands, stick to it. And that's not what I'm implying here. And like we've been working with HADC as an organization, very young people. They're former child soldiers. A lot of them didn't finish school, et cetera. So like we're having to walk them through what it means to keep a budget. And we're okay with that, right? Because proper budgeting, transparency, and reporting is something that we have to do for reasons other than just because it's a rule, right? So don't be afraid to kind of bring what you need as an organization to make sure things stay in order and transparent. And so all this leads to a summary of South Kivu, right? So one of the more violent places in the world. When Milk came to us, is a place I had been working, and is a place plagued by intercommunity conflict that has been experiencing violence for 30 years. Much like gangs in LA or mafia members in New York, the fighting there is a lot about community interests and protection, economic interests especially, right? And so what's been happening, what the actual peace process that we've been engaging in, that we've developed with our partners, is coming to the table of as many different actors as we could find and saying, how is peace going to break out? What do you need? Right. And so we've had 2 dialogues, first with armed group members and representatives and lower level members of the government. And then secondly, what we just implemented last month was a meeting of armed group leaders, generals, et cetera, and the very tippity top of the government in Kinshasa that flew out along with provincial and district leaders. In the middle, we had a meeting just with women, and we, at all 3 instances, said, how do we resolve this conflict? And what we've been learning has been informing what I believe to be some of the more revelatory approaches to peace that South Kivu has ever seen. And I'll put my money where my mouth is, right? Is it going to work? We'll see. But I certainly think that we've got a really great shot at moving towards peace, little by little. So if you're interested more in following what we're doing, follow the Carter School, follow what we're doing there. You can also follow Innovations in Peace Building International, my organization. We talk a lot about it there. If you're interested in giving, we always need investment at the Carter School. So yeah, we have concluded many of the peace dialogues. Now we're moving toward a DDR phase that is going to look a lot like community reintegration, that is community focused and not individual focused. This isn't about give us your gun. It's more about why don't we make a path for you to go home? Because many of the fighters have said during all of our meetings, we are tired. So that's where we're at. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. There's a lot there. I would love any questions. Oh, Jenna.
Hello, I hope you're doing well. So you had mentioned that you guys wanted to, I think, like implement DDR.
Mhm.
Have you ever done that before? And if so, what challenges do you face doing that?
Sorry, did you kind of say that again?
Sorry, you talked about the next step is a DDR. Have you ever done that before? And if so, what are common challenges that you face when trying to implement that?
Yeah, so so interestingly, like before this current project took hold, that's what my organization was doing all of, but at an individual level. So like we would send teams up into the armed groups and say, who wants to go home, basically. And we would fund that transition, but like individual by individual. So you might have 2 or 3 young people, 4 or 5 from a group say, I'm tired, I'm done, I'm going home. And so we would fund things like education, reintegration, et cetera. We saw a surprisingly low, possibly 0 recidivism. I've never heard of anybody going back from the program that we had implemented. Now, though, we're addressing like 3 of the 5 districts of the entire province of South Kivu, right? And so the way we think we're going to go about that, and the challenges inherent are and frankly, the opportunity that now exists is, what if we flip this whole thing on its head, DDR, and instead of focusing on the individual, or the group and say, come give us your guns and now go be peaceful and here's some money to start a farm. We are instead going to go to the communities and say, these are your people. These are your sons. These are your daughters, your nephews, your husbands. We have some money that we want to invest into reintegrating your family back into your village. But we need your village to tell us how to make that happen. It's based on something that's called the Marshall Plan back post-World War II. Kind of had a light bulb moment at the ISAs last week where I realized that the Marshall Plan was all about rebuilding Europe country by country, but by asking each country what it is that they wanted. How do you, Austria, want to go about rebuilding Austria? Here's the money. Oh, and by the way, if you're successful, we need you to just reinvest the money into Austria. What we see is in countries like Austria, there is still a pot of cash that gets circulated around that is Marshall Plan money to this day. And that's something that Julie Shedd taught me. And so when Julie taught me about that, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is where the key lies for the Congo, that if this is a community-based problem, it's communities that need protection, it's communities that need resources, it's communities that fight communities, and that's why armed groups exist, then we need to go to the root of the problem and actually invest in communities for the DDR process. Challenges, DDR, disarmament, what's the other one? Demobilization and reintegration. I'm not certain that the disarmament variable in that is something that we're necessarily going to pay attention to. The challenge is if these people totally disarm, there's not going to be anybody there to protect them when rebels from other countries like Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda come in and decide to ransack their village. So instead, we're just going to kind of ignore the issue of the guns and say, do you want to come in anyways? And oh, by the way, if you want to turn your guns, great. The federal government will take them, relieve you of them. So, yeah. Let's see, I got some chat questions. Studying something that I always ask myself is how to actually change those societies in a deeper way. So how is this new hybridity you talked about deals with not only direct violence, but also structural and cultural? Katerina, great question. We, as outsiders, will not change communities, period. Communities will change communities. What we feel like is if we have resources to invest, and we can lend strategy, right? I mean, again, we've got PhDs in peace building, and I've worked all over the world. We've got ideas and networks that we can bring to the table and say, hey, what do you think about this, right? But ultimately, structural violence, cultural violence is something that while we can illuminate, only the locals can say, here's how we want to fix it. If there's something endemic, right? If there's something that's like we see as being structurally violent in a particular village, that's something that we can, like, that's when we can turn into teacher, right? And say, hey, here's something you might want to think about. Rather than saying, hey, we demand that you change this. Because outsiders looking in and pointing down is not, won't ever really change things sustainably. Benjamin, yes, we typically do have internships at IPI. None right now, but ask me again this summer. Anybody else? All right, friends. Well, if there's no other questions, I will stop recording.